Hi, this is Roman or Ghost of Kiev on Twitter, and I'm going to try something new today. In my day job, I'm a data analyst that works with a lot of revenue data. So I figure why not put those skills to use in something that I've been very curious about recently, and this is the Russian budget deficit. So this is something that I'm doing for the first time, this kind of video, so please excuse any stumbles or inevitable snafus. But let's get into it. So what we saw last year is Russia posted, as the New York Times headline says, the second highest deficit in the post-Soviet era. And, $47 billion is a significant figure for an economy as small as Russia's. So I think any comparison to the American deficit is going to be very misleading. And then we continue to track this deficit data coming into this year with it posting consecutive deficits in January and February. And we're seeing right now it's at $34 billion. The reason I'd like to make this video is I think those top line figures are a little bit misleading or at least incomplete, because Russia reports its data and cumulative calendar year data. What that means is they don't break it out by a month. They just sum it up as the months add up. So you can see here it says January, February budget deficit wide is $34 billion. So it doesn't tell you how much that was in February, how much of that is in January, what the trends are. So I made a little dashboard that I'm going to get to in a second, and that will kind of go into the breakouts month by month. And last thing is, this is all driven by official Russian Ministry of Finance data. So obviously take it with a grain of salt, but I actually think it's pretty interesting. I think if nothing else, it shows you what they're willing to report. And looking at historical data, I think that data is pretty solid. So it gives you a good baseline. And then from there, we can see what's happening now. And I think that December month is very important because that is the starting point of the G7 oil price cap and the EU oil embargo. So that's a really important month because, as you'll see shortly, the sanctions that were applied prior to that oil price cap were, quite frankly, not really impacting the Russian budget, at least. I'm sure they were impactful in some areas, such as imports of various sanctioned products that help their military, but specifically in regards to the budget balance, as you'll see in a second, they had very little impact. So let's go to my little handy dandy dashboard. So this is the dashboard I put together a few days ago. It actually took a little while to pull everything together, rest of the data, but the Russian Ministry of Finance, to their credit, I guess, publishes pretty comprehensive data. At least they used to. Right now, they're only doing top line figures, so you can't break out what they're spending on, unsurprisingly. But at least we know the top line revenues and the top line expenditures. So looking at the Russian monthly budget balance, you can see that in the calendar year 2021, it was kind of up and down, but it was mostly steady. And then as we look at the start of the invasion, those first couple months were pretty good to them because oil prices were high. Europe was buying. Life, even though the spending was probably going up, as we'll check in a bit, life was pretty good. Very, very nice budget balance, doing pretty well going into May. Bit of a dip in June, July, and then back to happy days for them in November, right? So November was the last good month for Russian revenues and Russian budget balance, as you'll see. The December budget was a fiasco, a loss of $54 billion. And I'm using the conversion rate of $74 rubles per dollar. I think it's useful to do the conversion and not look at rubles. It gives us context. We don't know what rubles are worth. They might be worthless at this point, but it kind of gives us a context, at least what it was worth at the time when that number actually meant something. So first thing we notice is this big, big drop in the budget balance in December, right as the oil embargo and oil price cap came on. Unsurprisingly, I would argue. carrying on into January, another very tough month, almost $24 billion in deficit. And then, interestingly, February looks like a somewhat better month, only $11 billion in deficit, even though we saw an additional embargo and price cap on oil products such as gasoline, kerosene, anything that's refined, a diesel, anything that's refined from raw oil. So what's happening there? Let's go to the next dashboard, and we're going to look specifically at the revenues. So this is where I think we need to start looking at seasonality. Seasonality tells us what's happening in a given month, year to year. So basically, revenues fluctuate depending on when the taxes are due, depending on seasonal patterns such as fuel use. So kind of looking at month to month doesn't make as much sense as comparing apples to apples, December to December, January to January, February to February. So what I am going to do right now is I'm going to select those 3 months that we're very interested in. December, January, February. So give me 1 second while I do that. So let's do December, January, and February. Okay, here we go. So 2021, kind of a pandemic year. They struggled in the beginning, but it looks like revenues picked up towards the end. And we see that it's not quite 50%. Oil is not quite 50%. Oil and gas, excuse me, is not quite 50% of their revenues, but it's pretty close, actually. It's 11 billion, 26 billion, so up there. Then we get into January. So January is probably, I guess, the last quote unquote normal month. And we can see in January 2022, pretty similar distribution, about 35% is oil and gas revenue. February of 2022, it's there, you see that the oil is starting to make up a bigger and bigger chunk because the prices may be already starting to go up and Russia is making bank. And then we get to December of 2022. Interestingly enough, if you remember, that was the month that was a bit of a calamity, right? $54 billion deficit, but it's a month where they actually made, over $40 billion. It's probably the best performing month, but you can see that the distribution of revenues between oil and gas and other sources of income is starting to change, right? The percentage that's not oil and gas is becoming significantly higher. But still a pretty good month in terms of revenue in general, a bit of a bonanza. And you look at it seasonally, it's outperforming 2021. Very interesting. And then now we start to see the real impact of these sanctions. So you look at January and January 23, and they're struggling. They're making $5.7 billion versus $10 billion. That's a 50% drop. That's tough. Although the non-oil and gas revenue is doing relatively okay, 12 billion versus 17 billion. And then into February, it's interesting because it actually does better in February. So that's kind of interesting because I was expecting the refined oil products to really have an impact, and maybe not, or maybe they'll be delayed. But in any case, a bit of a rebound. And then the last thing we're going to look at is income versus expenses. So this is kind of tells us what's driving the deficit. So let's really quickly do the 3 months once again, and we can see a nice, interesting comparison. So December, January, February. Okay, so I think the thing that really immediately jumps out is the expenses in December of 2022. They are massive, absolutely massive, almost $100 billion in an economy that supposedly is, I don't know, somewhere around $1.2 trillion GDP per year. So this is like approaching 10% of GDP spending by government in 1 month. That's wild. So my guess is this is the army orders starting to come in a big way. They need armor, they need ammo, they're buying stuff from Iran probably. Big spending month, and it looks like a big spending month in general. In 2021, it was also a big spending month, but compared to scale, it's massive. And that's what was driving the deficit in December of 2022. And once again, the spending stays up, right? Like the revenue is doing worse as we saw in the previous slide, but it's really the spending that's really driving the deficit. So I think what we're seeing here is the combination, might not be particularly surprising, right? The combination of lower revenues and increased spending creates a deficit. Absolutely. So the question is, will this continue? Will the deficit remain in months to come? Is February a trend for a recovery? Is March going to have another lower deficit than compared to January and February? I'm sure there's some stuff going on behind the scenes. I'm sure there's some one-time taxes where they're just squeezing companies for all they're worth to get the funds they need to plug the budget deficit. So something to look out for is, do the oil and gas revenues recover? I don't see how. I don't understand how that's possible, especially with a refined oil ban. And do they try to make it up with the non-oil and gas revenues? Can they keep squeezing these companies, keep squeezing whatever these sources might be to generate the revenue they need to avoid massive deficits, massive additional borrowing? Who's even borrowing from Russia, or lending to Russia at this point? I don't quite understand. Are they just printing money and then passing it through their bank loans that are all run by the state? I think there's a couple of theories out there. This is not what this is about. This is looking specifically at deficit. And I think now we have at least a decent picture of what's going on. It's driven by massive spending. The oil price cap is having a real serious impact. And right now they're trying to hang on by squeezing the non-oil and gas revenue, which in a shrinking economy with lots of foreign companies pulling out, it'll be really interesting to see if there's any reporting exactly who's getting squeezed. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you for your time. Check out the links in the bottom for the dashboard and for the fundraising I'm doing for Amicus Ukraine, who sends cars that are confiscated by Lithuanian customs to Ukrainian frontline troops for logistical purposes, and also brings in humanitarian supplies. They're a great org. Not a lot of people know about them in the U.S., but they do amazing work with not a lot of money. So every little contribution helps. Thank you so much for your time. And if you like this, let me know. Give me some feedback, and maybe I'll keep this going, and maybe I won't if people think this is dumb. Thank you.